So, you're from Canada. Have
Yep. Calgary, Alberta.
you lived in Canada all your life?
I have, yeah. There's been some stints. I don't think longer than maybe 6 weeks or so. Actually, never mind. We were just in Boston for 10 months a couple years ago. So that's the longest I've lived outside of Canada.
So what were you doing in Boston?
I was studying at Sattler College. I did a 1-year biblical and religious studies certificate. And there was a twofold reason for being there. The other reason was to learn from followers of the way. We were interested in urban church planting. I guess we never thought about it in those terms. We just knew that we would like to help plant a church in a city. And Followers of the Way is a group of churches in the city. And we wanted to be close to them and see what that looked like. What's it look like to have a family in the city and things like that.
So that's a pretty neat idea to go live there for 10 months?
Yeah, it was. Part of that, the length, was because we were expecting a baby. And so we stayed a little bit longer. Instead of traveling home quickly before the birth, we stayed there and had a child in Boston.
So does that mean you have an American baby now?
That's right. So me and my daughter are the only ones with American citizenship.
So wait, you have American citizenship?
My parents are both American.
So wait a minute. Your parents are both American, and they moved to Canada when you were young?
No, when they were young. My dad was 5, I believe, when they moved to British Columbia to plant a church up there. My grandpa moved up there so if Dad was 5, that would have been 59.
Okay.
1959.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Uh-huh.
So your dad moved to British Columbia with a group. Was that nationwide then?
Yeah. Well, that was early stages of nationwide. Yeah.
Kind of
Yeah.
pre-nationwide?
It wasn't long after they had pulled out of Lancaster Conference.
Okay.
Yeah.
And why did he move to British Columbia? Like what was he chosen? Did he want to go, or like what was up with that?
Well, some of my dad's older sisters were married and ended up there and said would come back and tell their dad about the work up there, the need. And so Grandpa decided to move up there and plant a church. And out of that church in McBride, British Columbia, a lot of churches were planted then in Western Canada.
Okay. I would not have realized, you being from Alberta, you kind of have a circuitous route getting there.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
So how did you get from, how are you getting from British Columbia? Were you born in British Columbia?
No, I was born in Alberta. So in the early 70s, late 70s, Dad was asked to go help start a church in northern Alberta.
Okay.
So not far from the Northwest Territories border. There's a small German-speaking community up there, like Russian Mennonites. Mm-hmm. And so him and his twin brother James, who then, not long after they moved up there, was called to go to the Philippines to help out with the work there. So Dad ended up staying up there, and I was born when they lived up there. And then when I was 13, we moved about 5 hours south, planted another church there in more central Alberta.
So your dad still lives in northern Alberta?
No, he now lives in North Carolina.
Oh,
as
wait a minute.
About a summer or so ago. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lots of moving around.
Oh, wow. So he made a big round.
Yeah, that's right.
Wow.
Yeah. My dad was actually born in Carlisle, so not that far from here.
So your dad
Carlisle,
was
Pennsylvania.
Pretty local.
Yeah.
Well, that is interesting. So you're in Alberta. You moved down to see what Followers of the Way is doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really interested in the time you spent there, especially as it relates to church planting, because you already had a vision of doing something,
Mm-hmm.
and then you moved down there. And does that change your view? Does it make your view, broaden your view? Like how does that affect your view living there?
I think it makes it more. Our time there made it more realistic to live in the city. I had been living in the city for a number of years, over a decade, and so I was accustomed to city life, raised on a farm. But what we saw in Boston was pockets of believers that met in houses, that got to know their neighbors, that had developed what they call fishing ponds, or areas that they would frequent where it was normal for them to go there and hang out and meet people. And what we saw was urban living with large families, some of them 8, 9, 10. I think one family has 12 children.
Wow.
And raising those children in the city to be godly men and women who are then getting married and having children of their own living in the city. So it basically put into everyday life what it means to live in the city and grow a church in the city.
So what about those fishing ponds? What's that?
It's basically places that you would go to evangelize. I'm trying to think of some good examples of that. I know that in the one congregation, there was down the street from where they live, there's a basketball court. The young man would go down and play pickup basketball with the neighbor boys. And eventually one of those boys joined the church. And they were able to, disciple him from just a community boy to being a brother in Christ. And he's a part of the church there now. So that's a good example of a fishing pond, yeah. It's a place that I think it's defined as a place that you can go and hang out, that it would be normal for you to be there. It'd be like playing basketball or joining a debate club or, stuff like that.
So somewhere where you can actually interact with neighbors.
Right,
Or, yeah.
Interact with unbelievers and build relationships and lead people to Christ.
So you're going back to Alberta to start a church. Did they offer you any kind of help, or are you just like, what's happening? You're there at Follows the Way, but then how are you, like what kind of framework are you having to actually start a church? Are you just going to go start a church, or?
They provide oversight. Like they provide so they have apostles, ordained apostles in their church, and one of those men would be considered our apostle. And functionally, it follows the pattern of the New Testament quite closely. We were in southern Alberta. There were some other families further north in Alberta that were looking for some options. We ended up all going to Boston. But before that happened, Finney came up to Alberta, met us, talked about our needs and the vision and the hope that we had there. And through that meeting, we came together with the people from northern Alberta with the same vision to plant a church in Calgary, and then moved to Boston as a place to get to know and see what was going on there. And then moving back to Calgary, then now Finney has come out and ministered to us out there, and I would say that he has functioned similar to the role that the Apostle Paul functioned in the churches. Here's a call, goes there, assesses the need, brings people together, forms a church, and works with that church then to see it flourish and grow.
So you didn't just jump into decide, hey, I'm going to go start a church in Alberta?
No, that's right. It's interesting to talk about this in light of church planting and using all that lingo. Mm-hmm. We never at any point really thought about ourselves as church planters, right. And I still don't today. Yeah. My wife and I came to Christ in 2019, and after our little stint through a Baptist church, we felt a need for other faithful people to fellowship with. And so when we first talked to Followers of the Way, it was either we'll go to another church or can we get help here? But the whole goal is that I think being alone for a while, we realized very keenly that we need a body of believers. We have to have brothers and sisters. I'm not going to stand before Christ and hear him say, well done, unless there's a good, solid group of brothers around me. And so it's more of a heart of we need fellowship, and this is the place that needs the gospel. So let's pull some believers together and learn to love each other well in this community, and in that way, let the world know that Jesus Christ is alive.
That's pretty neat that that you, being fairly new in the faith, are helping to start this church. And it's not by yourself. Obviously, mm-hmm. There's others there, but how does that feel to you to be out there? Don't you feel kind of unequipped?
Well, I would say there's something that I can say about the upbringing that I had and the example that my dad, was to me and my older brothers. I left the Mennonite church in my early 20s, but I would say that the coming to back to faith and embracing the path of Christ and following Jesus Christ, I know that there's a foundation that was laid, being a part of that church, being raised in the home that I was a part of. And it's a question that's come up before, like, well, if we've only been a follower of Jesus Christ since 2019, I mean, that'll be 6 years in a couple months since that happened. But I think I draw from a lot of teaching, and, there's things that I remember and good perspective that was taught me, as a child and being a teenager in that church. And I think I draw from that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. So you spent some years outside the fold. How long was that?
Just a little over 10 years.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. So your upbringing really kind of didn't go away in that time.
That's right. You can't run away from the things. When the Bible says that train up a child in the way they should go, and when they're old, they won't depart from it. I felt like I did depart from it, but it never departed from me. There was times I tried to tell myself I didn't believe in God and stuff like that, but you can't kid yourself. I mean, if you're taught from little up that you were created by God, trying to tell yourself something else, it might work for a little while, but it's a self-deception that's really hard to make stick.
Yeah, right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So at this point, how many families are there where you live?
There's 3 families.
3 families.
Yeah.
Is that including you or besides you?
Including us.
Okay.
Yeah.
So 3 families. How many children?
I think there's 25 people in all. Actually, there's an older single brother that's there with us as well, that actually was meeting with my wife and I before we went to Boston. He traveled 2 hours every Sunday to fellowship with us, and has since moved to Calgary and joined our fellowship there. And he's been a blessing. And so I think there's 25 people. And so if you subtract 7 adults, that's
wow. You're outnumbered
that's
a
many
little
children.
bit,
That's right. Yeah.
So how old is the oldest of those?
17.
Okay.
Yeah.
And everybody lives in Calgary?
That's right. Yeah, we actually all live less than a 10-minute walk, about a 10-minute walk from each other.
That's really neat. So talk about that a little bit. That's something that's kind of I want to say, I hope it's not a fad, but it is something that is definitely really a big focus right now in church planting or
close proximity.
Yeah.
I really hope it's not a fad, because for me, it's a core principle. There's an aspect of living close together that changes your relationship with the people that you fellowship with. And it's hard to imagine how much it changes, because when you say, well, you see each other more, it's easier to go to each other's houses, it doesn't sound like it's going to make that big of a difference. But when you live in close proximity to each other and you know that you're just a short walk away from your brothers and sisters, it changes how you think about their accessibility. Like, you don't have to get in the vehicle and drive over. If you did, it would be a minute or less.
So you're saying it changes how it changes your attitude towards life in general as
That's right.
Your accessibility to your brothers and sisters.
That's right.
Because you know they're right there.
That's right.
Okay.
And it lowers the barrier to getting together. I actually feel like it does. It makes a difference to how quickly you are able, like, you can be out for a walk. And I mean, you've experienced a little bit with Brian's used to live with you up there on Lime Rock.
Well, Brian's do now. So
yeah, that's right. And so in an evening, I mean, a walk down the street and see who's outside to say hi, that's an easy thing to do. And when you live in that close proximity with your church, the older brother doesn't live quite as close. And I think he still feels like he's not quite in it. And it's not, we don't mean to. Mm-hmm. We want him to feel it. It's our longing that he feels like he's in the group and a part of it and benefiting from all the fellowship that we have and things like that. But it's just not the same when you're not that close. So I would feel like close proximity is a gift when a group of believers can manage that. And the way that worked out in Calgary, I mean, it was our dream to have it that way, but when we think of all the stories about how we ended up in the houses we ended up, and we're kind of in a triangle with, very close proximity to each other, it feels like a gift from God. It really does. Because the housing market is very tight. Nothing stays on the market very long. Prices are very high. So there was budgets, there was sizes of house for families, and a lot of factors that come into play there. And for us to be that close, it feels like it was God designed.
So with only 3 families, I mean, a lot of people would say, well, 3 families, that's not even a church. I mean,
yeah, that's a fair assumption, and we feel that as well. I guess we're in the honeymoon phase of a church where it's just a few people. There's not a lot of effort. I mean, there's not a lot of need to put a lot of effort into communication because you're all
right.
Kind of in the same loop, and it's pretty simple. But we feel like we're that we enjoy this, but we don't want to get comfortable here. We want the church to grow. There's actually a family in Calgary right now that's there looking at houses and potentially wants to move there to join our fellowship. I heard from another family this week who wants to pursue the immigration process and move from the States to Canada. So we'll see how that goes. So in 6 months, there could be 5 families there, which would be really exciting for us to move into that stage of church life.
So how do you communicate? Like, you talk about being close together and all that, but like, do you have a Telegram or WhatsApp group?
WhatsApp, yeah.
So everybody's on a WhatsApp group, and you can kind of
drop everything on there. Yeah.
Is that actually do you end up chatting someone there too, or is it just...
Not a whole lot. Yeah, it's mostly just arrange a meeting or put details or prayer requests and things like that on there. There's not a ton. And then there's a brothers chat. So sometimes the brothers will discuss something on that, and a sisters chat, and they'll discuss sister things on there.
So how important do you think those kind of like, I'm just thinking, when you talk about church planting and you're going to a remote area, and like, how do you feel about this technology? I've heard pros and cons both ways. Like, either you have, and we have way too many, like, I have a friend in Boston that said, like, he just wishes we didn't have any of these, WhatsApp and Telegram and all this stuff. So it feels to me like the technology does 2 things. That brings us together, but it also allows us to not interact face to face as much.
Right. And I think limiting it to pertinent details, and that's it. Like, all the discussions should happen face to face, as much as possible. I mean, hey, we're thinking of going over to this park to do this function. Who's interested? Sure, we would like to. It doesn't work for us, and that's about it. You would have those conversations on the phone, I would think, before WhatsApp. You call somebody, see what's going on, send the call around, and make the decisions that way,
Well, that works, but then you end up playing telephone.
Right, exactly.
Especially if you have 15 instead of 3.
Exactly.
But
yeah.
So you're at the stage now where you can do that. I just thought about like there's a lot of small churches that there's, for good reasons, church have different levels of technology, and some of them are not going to have access to like a WhatsApp group. So let's say you're in town and you're all 10 minutes away, like you could use like a hotline or something maybe, but that I think that's one thing that for our church really has been helpful, is that we have a Telegram group that everybody's on, so you can just put out there that like, hey, somebody needs to go to the airport, or there's even a little bit of chit chat, just odds and ends, or like sledding, like it's, hey, we're gonna have sledding, and so it's those things kind of bring like, there's something about community, like you're talking about, the proximity I think is huge, and I think a lot of people just don't get that.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. It has become such a part of the Anabaptist ecosystem to be distant from each other, that when you talk about the value of being close together, it's missed. And like that's why I said at the beginning of the conversation about that when you say, oh, you're more likely to go to someone's house and all that, well we do, we pop over for coffee and stuff like that. But the community I grew up in, some of us were 40 minutes apart. You're not popping over for coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a bit extreme to have people that far apart within one church community, but it's not uncommon. And it's hard to put into words because it changes how you think about your group when you're that close. Like it changes the premise that you're functioning on in a lot of ways. And it's a powerful tool, I think, for a church.
So we've had some discussion about whether or not the church has the right to ask that.
Mm-hmm.
You said it's core.
Yeah.
So can you defend that from Scripture, or or how are you going to feel about it when somebody moves in your community and says, hey, you know what, we really want to raise cows, so we're going to be 40 minutes out of town, but we want to come worship with you.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are you going to deal with that?
That's a valid question. We had similar discussions to this early on.
You've already had those discussions?
Yeah, there was a family that was thinking about moving down to Calgary, and they didn't want to move into the city. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to stay out on the edge so they could keep the horses and the cows and things like that. We told them, we can't keep you from doing that, but you're just not going to be just functionally, it's not going to be the same for you as the rest of the people in the church. So if there's one family that's commuting in for all the events, they're not making it to all of them. Right. They're missing out on that underlying benefit of being that close. And so it kind of weeds out the people that want to do that. It's like, how do you tell somebody you can't fellowship with us? I mean, if they want to be a part of a biblical church. But we would say, I know Darren and Clifford and I, the two other brothers up there, we've talked about this many times. We would ask people to move in, and if they don't want to, well, can we help you start a church where you're at? Mm-hmm. That way we're not trying to make a pile, and it actually speaks to some of our expansion dreams and visions, so that if someone is converted in another community that's 10 minutes away, 15 minutes away, I mean, obviously there's going to be times of commuting for discipleship and things like that, but we would be more of the mind, what does it look like to have a church fellowship in that community? Instead of bringing everyone into our community or calling everyone to move locally. We live in Brentwood. Well, we want more churches in Calgary than in Brentwood. So we would be quicker to explore, what does it look like to have a meeting in your community instead of everyone coming onto one pile? And I realize there's a lot of things to consider there about the maturity of the people that, are there. Are they, who's going to move in there? Who's going to support that? I mean, there's a lot of things to consider there, but we would like to be quicker to do that than try to force people to move in close.
Yeah. So when we're talking about community and the proximity, I think we could really, some of the benefits are unrealized. Mm-hmm. Like you're talking about popping into people's houses. We don't do that much here. Like here at State College, we don't do that much. I'm really kind of surprised at how little we get in each other's houses. We used to do some house church. We don't do that as much anymore. There is more spontaneous, just like dropping by, on the deck, in the yard, whatever. But like us and Brian's, we live, a couple houses apart. It's not like we actually get in each other's houses, but they walk by on the road, we say hi. Mm-hmm. Our children, their children bike together some up and down the road. And like Delbert lives right next to us. Jeanette lives above us. So like we're interacting with those people all the time. We don't realize that we're interacting with them because we don't actually come in and sit down for coffee necessarily. Mm-hmm. But, Delbert's shooting his bow in the backyard and the children go over to watch, and just all these little things that happen that are really natural, like you said, mm-hmm. but they're not significant necessarily. Mm-hmm. They're not. So somebody says, well, how can you say that proximity matters when you don't even spend time in each other's house?
Right. Those life-on-life things are important as well. We're human, interactions with other humans are good and healthy. And the more you have that and live in a way that you get that with the brethren in your church, I think that's just a healthy relationship. But there is something to be said about sitting on each other's couches. There's something about sitting on someone's couch and having a coffee with them. And you might not discuss anything too deep sometimes, and sometimes it might go way deep, but providing that opportunity that it does happen sometimes is great. Like something that happens every so often is Darren and Linda will go for a walk. They have a little dog, and they'll take their dog for a walk, and we'll have a knock on our door. It might be 8 o'clock in the evening, and you put on a pot of coffee and you sit down, and it could be, an hour, it could be 2, could be whatever the conversation dictates. And just have a conversation about what you're feeling, thinking. I think those things, you still have to be intentional to make them happen, even if you're in close community.
Right.
We lived in Calgary for years as unbelievers, and we didn't know any of our neighbors. You have to be intentional to do those things. Right. I mean, we know our neighbors now where we live, but it still takes an effort, and it is an effort that's. I feel like whether we live next door to each other or 10 minutes walk from each other or a 10-minute drive from each other, that investment in the body to have those kind of interactions is invaluable.
So 2 things I want to think about, and one is our neighbors, like you said, getting to know our neighbors, and another is, I guess before we get off on that one, I'll ask you this one. Do you think the Amish have it figured out by with their buggies? Like, does that, that like shrinks, that is one of their principles with the buggy is actually to shrink the community, so that you only have a certain amount of distance to be able to drive. So you see, like, I find it interesting driving down the road, like when you hit an Amish community, it's like, horse manure on the road for a few miles and then it's over, unless you're getting into a big one. But it's not like you have this huge spread out area. So are there horses that we can put into, horses that we can use?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I wouldn't have actually thought about that with the limited transportation, that they actually keep their communities a little bit smaller because they can't drive 2 hours,
Right.
If they go down the road 10 minutes, that's not very far on a horse. And I think that's a pretty valuable thing to consider. What are the horses that we could put into place to circle the wagons, pull things a little bit closer?
Yeah, no, I've looked at, I like where we live for proximity, but then I see somewhere, like, I'm not a compound kind of person. Like, I feel like the compound is the opposite.
Right, yeah.
So
that's the other end of the spectrum, is that you would all live kind of in one little pile.
Yeah. And why is, and in your mind, like, why is a compound a negative, but then close proximity a positive? Like, there must be such a thing as too close.
There was a time when I wouldn't have thought so. I would say that before we went to Boston, my wife and I's dream would have been that, is there a way we can buy an apartment building, with 12 or 18 units in it, knock some walls down, make room for big families, and then have some big units, us in a unit, rent out the ones you don't use, have one for a church, have one for a school, whatever, all in the one building with a playground out back or something like that. Like, that was something that we dreamed about. And I still think it's a good option. But now that we've all been living in Calgary for a year, just over a year now, there's something unique about where Clifford's are and the ministry that they have and the people that they interact with. And there's something unique about where Darren's are and who they interact with and the ministry that they have. And it's unique about where we are. It's almost like, we are all very close, but we minister to different people. It's not like we're talking to Darren's neighbors. We're interacting with our neighbors. And our street is full of nationalities. I mean, we have Indians, Chinese, Mauritius, Moroccan, the list goes on our street, whereas Darren's interact with more Caucasian families with young children and some older people. And Clifford and Becky have a lot of older people around them and some Asians. And their young boys are out mowing lawns and helping these old people and stuff. And that's amazing. It's like they have their own ministry all together on their own street. So you wouldn't have that if you were all in one pile. I mean, you would have that with that group around you, whatever your area is, but spreading it out a little bit seems to increase the impact a little bit.
So it's a little bit like fishing on a party boat. Have you ever fished on a party boat?
I haven't.
So a party boat's the funniest thing. Like you go out, they take you deep sea fishing.
Oh, yeah. I have done that, yeah.
And you go out, but then you're on this, then there's 40, 50 people on this boat and you're just fishing off the sides.
Right. And it just looks like this.
Yeah.
You think about it from a fish's perspective. There's a ring of hooks hanging in the water.
Yeah, right. It's like maybe we can swim through there.
Right.
So that's kind of like your apartment building idea would be a party boat.
Yeah.
Everybody's in the same place. We're all fishing around the edge. I mean, obviously people are going to go out and work and things like that, but versus, all these little fishing ponds scattered all over.
Yeah, that's a really good way to look at it. And that's, before we would have thought just church-wise, it would have been nice to be on a pile. And I think that close proximity would be nice. But now that we've been there for a while, I can see the wisdom in having a little breathing room between.
So when you lived in Boston, did you live in an apartment with somebody else?
No. Well, not church people.
Okay.
We lived on the main floor suite of a house, and there was people living above us, but we didn't go to church with them or anything.
So I've heard pros and cons of that, of living in. So I think it's kind of neat. Like I said, Jeanette lives above us, and Delbert lives right beside us. So we are actually in the same community.
Right.
We interact with the same neighbors, but then, Delbert has his job, Jeanette has her job, so they're going out. They have different people they interact with, and they'll bring different people home, or they'll interact with different people. But I'm surprised, like just with us and Brian's, we're only we're half a block apart, and they have a slightly different interaction. While I can see their neighbors,
right,
I interact very little with their neighbors.
Right. Yeah.
But then we have like 30 or 40 households really close to us because we live close to apartment buildings, and so we interact more with them. And
so it's almost the same concept. Even though you are very close, there's still different interactions that
right, our ponds almost overlap.
Right.
But it's still like we kind of have our different, it's just different people that we interact with. So, and I feel like if we all lived in the same house, it would be quite different. Like we could, if we were all living in this apartment right here, it would be different than that.
Yeah, I agree. And there is one thing about, because I have seen where there's multiple families living in one area, and it creates, I guess the best way to say it creates opportunities for relational growth, because there is going to be conflict with the children. There's going to be rules that need to be outlined, methods of management and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that if it's approached with that kind of insight, which we saw done very well in Boston, just lay it out the ground rules. This isn't allowed, let's make it clear. And one thing that we were exposed to in Boston that I had never seen before were parents that would just have frank conversations about their children with each other. And that to me was pretty amazing. I mean, you have to have pretty thick skin to sit down with somebody and have frank conversations with them about the behavior of their children. So it teaches humility. It teaches you not to take yourself too seriously as a parent, because you're in close proximity with other parents. You're making mistakes. They see them. Your children are doing dumb things that you're not proud of, and other people are seeing it. So when you realize that we're all facing the same thing and that we all want the same results, and you can kind of check your ego at the door, it can actually be a great opportunity to learn and to grow together. That was something that we saw firsthand, and we, tried to assimilate was, let's be a little bit more open about our homes and our children. And so living in really close proximity forces you to do that.
Yeah.
And it either blows up or you work out a system to work together harmoniously. So it can go either way.
So interacting with your neighbors, like one of the things that we run into with neighbors is it tends to be really difficult to get to know people. Like you said, you lived in Calgary for what 10 plus years
Yeah.
and didn't know your neighbors.
No.
So why didn't you know your neighbors and why do you now? Like what's the difference?
Well,
Is it neighborhood?
no, it's not neighborhood. It's a change of perspective. I mean, not a servant. I mean, before I was a servant of Christ, you lived your own life. Like you had your own stuff going on and you didn't really care. I mean, I can think of one house I lived in Calgary. I knew the old guy that lived next door. I ended up doing work for him. One of my roommates did a bunch of work for him too, and we kind of befriended him. But that was a unique situation. He would come over and knock on our door and be like, "Hey, can you guys help me do this and do that?" And so some young guys living in a house, that's how we got to know him. But a lot of the neighbors we didn't get to know because you're focused on your own life. And obviously, as a disciple of Christ, that changes. You're not focused inward anymore. You're focused, your eyes are open to what's going on around you. And something that my wife and I try to do is we try to have people in our home every Thursday. Winter months change that. Usually people are a little more sick. They're not as willing to get out of the house and all that kind of stuff. So we've kind of fallen off of that in the last couple months, but it's something that we've tried to do for a number of years, even before we went to Boston. And that's one good way to get the people on your street into your home. Have them in for a meal or coffee or something, and talk to them on the sidewalk and shovel it for them if it needs, or just the emphasis is so different. Now we're seeing souls, people, potential friends and brothers and sisters in Christ.
So when you have people into your house, like that's pretty awkward for most people. How do you manage that? Like it's awkward for both parties usually.
Right.
So like is there a particular way you put that invitation out there, or do you just say, hey, come over for
just, hey, come over for a meal one time,
Okay.
So in October, we moved up the street about 8 houses. And I'm trying to remember if we actually knew the people that lived beside us. We got to know the people behind us and still do because we live on the same street. But I was down there picking up stuff and we haven't followed through on this yet. But I meet the young guy that moved in and I'm like, hey, nice to meet you. Chatted a little while and he seemed like a friendly person and fairly open. It's like, hey, if you'd want to, you can pop by our house for a meal sometime. And he thought you'd like that. So it gets to be kind of a part of, we've done it at the park. Parks are good fishing ponds if you want a good fishing pond.
Okay, why?
Take your children down to the park and they end up playing with somebody else's children and you end up standing beside them at some point and strike up a conversation. And from that conversation, you end up talking about your children and school and whatever else. And eventually it's like, hey, what are you doing next Saturday? Do you want to come by for dinner? And more times than not, they say, sure. They're usually a little shocked. Mm-hmm. They're like, oh, who's this guy? Just come by. And we have friendships to this day that happened. I met a guy in the park with his son a year ago. And now we get back and forth in each other's homes regularly.
So do you run into any problem with when you invite somebody like that, they immediately suspect that you are some religious fanatic that's trying to indoctrinate them? It's like some people would have a wall like, whoa, like, what are you trying to sell me?
No, and I think that has to do with Calgary. The response, and I don't know what, obviously we haven't been in many cities living as Christians, but the response in Calgary is almost an open curiosity. Okay. Even if you're seeing our women, our wives, modest, head covering, there's no opposition. Like there's no wall that comes up. Especially if they're Muslim or anything like that, they actually appreciate it. Makes them really happy to see women dressed like that. So we haven't run into it at all. And even the one family, Christina, the lady, walked by our house every day, still does, taking her son to daycare, and she ended up chatting with her on the sidewalk, met her at the park, bumped into her here and there, and finally said, hey, come over to our house sometime. And they come over and they are evangelical Christians. So that happens too, but we haven't faced opposition as far as religion goes.
So when you have, like, now you're fishing, So how does this fishing work? Like you have somebody into your house. It usually doesn't take long to figure out whether they're religious or not. But like, how does this actually? So how do you move that, or do you try to move that beyond just friendship? Like, what state do you wait for them to say, hey, what are you guys about, or do you have kind of a do you have a pre do you have a way of kind of, are you thinking about like, when am I going to spring it on them?
You're always thinking about ways to bring up your faith, and try to do it in conversation, in context of life. You know, we faced an issue, prayed about it, you know, or introduce them to the idea that you're people of faith, that you believe in God, you're followers of Jesus Christ in that way. We don't have a set way of doing it, and honestly, I don't know if the way we're doing it is a good way. At some point, like with the one couple, we just asked them, would you be interested in doing a Bible study sometime? And that was after talking to them, and we haven't had the Bible study yet. They said they would, and it's been a while, and we haven't. And there was a lot of things that came into play that didn't let it happen. But that's our goal, and it's something my wife and I talk about often, is we're not just interested in making friends. I mean, obviously we love having new friends and things like that, but with the Muslim couple, they're actually from the Ukraine, but they're Crimean Tatars, so they're Muslim. Have them in our home. We talk about Jesus Christ. We share our story with them, our testimony. And the thing is they're all just like, yes, you know, that's amazing. We believe in God too. And so that's been a hard thing. We haven't asked them to do a Bible study yet. I guess that's the next one, is try to get them to do a Bible study. I think that's our goal.
So you have a lot of Muslims. What's like the evangelical people that are coming by, they'd probably be a little offended if you ask for a Bible study. How do you, like, what's your difference in approach, or do you have a different way of talking to them about some of these things versus, you know, if somebody's an unbeliever or, you know, someone of a different faith, it's easier to say, hey, we can fix your problem, or we know we have a solution.
Yeah.
Versus somebody that does believe that they are, you know, made right with Christ, and then you're offering them more. Do you, like, how does that work?
A recent example of that is a young couple that had moved to Calgary for health reasons. There's a clinic there that she was going to for treatment. They would have been our professing Christians. They moved to Mexico for the winter, so they're not there with us anymore. But they were coming every Sunday and Wednesday night while they're there. And first time we had them in the home, you know, we're chatting about our faith. They're telling us about theirs, and ask them about baptism, ask them about their journey into the church, like what constitutes, or what's the foundation of your faith? Where did you get your information? Like, who discipled you? So basically, we ended up having a conversation about baptism. He wasn't sure about his. He was more infant baptized as a Dutch Reformed. And she had been baptized as a believer, but then she said, well, that's because my mom forced me to do it. And then later conversations I've had with them to feel out, like, are they hungry? Do they want to grow? Or are they just looking for a church to park and be comfortable? You know, what are you growing in? What are the challenges that you're facing in your spiritual life? Is your marriage growing? Like, I find that if they're believers, treat them as equals, just like you would challenge another believer.
Okay.
Because I would have tended to go to them on the premise that I have something you need, and so I'm going to ask you pointed questions so that I can give you what I need. But if you treat them as equals, oh, you're a believer in Christ, so am I. So I'll treat you like a brother, and which means that you're free to challenge them. You're free to ask questions about why they believe what they believe, and all that kind of stuff.
So that's kind of judge not, except those that are inside the church.
Right.
Okay.
And it was a hard concept for me to embrace, because, and that's more a testimony to my own spiritual pride.
Well, it's not your Mennonite background. I mean,
no.
We're kind of like, okay, you guys Mennonites or not.
And you need to be like us.
Yeah.
And I want them to be like me as I'm a follower of Christ. And I want them to embrace the historic faith. But if it becomes a me versus you, then you have a battle on your hands. Then it's more of a debate and it's more of a struggle. You have to be careful with that though, because then they wonder why they're not a part of communion and stuff like that. But it does open the door to some honest conversation when you're willing to just, oh, well, I guess we're both believers in Christ. So have you considered this teaching of his? And what impact does it have on your life? Just like you would with a brother in your church or something like that.
So how often, you talk about them not being a part of communion, how often do you have communion?
Every Sunday.
Every Sunday. So how does that, is that part of the service or?
It's a separate part. We invite our guests. So our schedule, we meet at noon, we have lunch, and then we commune together. And then we invite our guests at 3:30, and then our service is at 4.
Okay. So guests come in at 3:30, service starts at 4.
That's right.
And your communion, you said, is right after the meal. So
Right after lunch.
So you've pretty much got the historic pattern nailed.
Well, that's what we're going for, I guess. We don't want to do anything novel.
Yeah. No kidding. You don't want to reinvent the wheel.
No, that's right. Yeah. And we just changed it recently. We had been having our lunch, and then there was a break, a time, they wanted to put some children down for naps and things like that. And then we were communing, but it always felt like it was a little chaotic then, so we decided, I don't think it was even a month ago, why don't we just do it like Jesus did and have the bread and the cup at the meal? Let's eat our meal and share together.
Okay.
And that's been a real blessing. And I think all the brothers and sisters have testified to that, blessing them to do it that way.
So we have a meal with our service, but we don't have communion every Sunday. It's actually Thursday nights, once a month. But I always like to tell people that our service includes the meal.
Right.
It's not before it's easy to kind of get in the pattern and say, well, your meal is before the service, but that's not.
It's all part of it.
It's all part of it.
And
it's a part of that community.
Right. Exactly.
That close community.
Yes, it is. Yeah. To share a meal with people and break bread together is a precious thing. And it's, the early church, that's how they practiced it. You were in the home, you had a meal together, you broke bread, you shared the cup, and it was part of that family feel. We sit around the table and we share Christ together.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's a little bit of a break from your upbringing, though. Like what made you decide? Like, why would you decide to kind of go with the historic faith instead of the pattern that you were brought up with? Like, what in your life drew you towards that?
I think for me personally, it was the meaningfulness of breaking bread with your brothers and sisters, and the means of grace that it is in our lives to do that. So we have a time, we eat our meal, we share about our week and struggles and victories and our walk with Christ, and then we break bread together. And when we first were introduced to that way of doing things, I hate to call things models because we can fall in love with models and fall out of love with models, but introduced to that way of doing things, that practice, and after participating in that for a few weeks, you go, man, how did I live without doing this every week? There's something about it that knits a body of believers together. When you hear the heart of your brothers and sisters, and I feel like that's a key element to it as well. And it doesn't have to be a long ordeal, but just to talk about, what has Christ done for me this week? Or what have I done that has grieved Christ this week? And then share in the bread and the cup together. And to do that every week, we were in Boston, there was 4 of us families, and it was not any of our custom to do it this way. And it wasn't long into it where, I'm sitting with the other brothers and we're talking about this, and we all just shook our head and said, I don't know, how we approached our Christian life without this. It seemed like it became such a key part of our experience as disciples of Christ.
So are there other things like that you feel, I think communion is probably one of the most underrated things in the
right.
as far as in our background, probably the most underrated because
I would agree.
we have a lot of things that we hold to that are part of the historic faith, but that's one that somehow we just completely dropped. Almost, not quite.
There's one thing I want to say in regards to that. One of the pushbacks that we've gotten for doing it so often is that you'll cheapen it. It'll make it less special somehow. And I would say that it does exactly the opposite. That when you sit and remember the sacrifice that was made for you with your brothers and sisters, it knits you together in love, and your appreciation for the sacrifice of Christ increases. It actually is. And I remember looking at it before and thinking that could be the case, because if it comes around twice a year, it's a special event. But I can say that in my own experience, it actually was the exact opposite experience.
So I wonder, like I'm a little curious. Like you're about the same age as I probably.
Should be close.
I'm 45, so I don't know how old you are, but
about 6 years younger.
No, you're way younger than I. Okay, well I'm the old guy in the room.
Maybe the gray and the beards make us the same age.
Well, we're still we're in the same age bracket,
right?
But I've been trying to figure out, is it age or is it actually the way it is? Because I've gotten to the place now where I'm like, communion to me is the central focus of the church. Like I could, message, sure, that's okay. Singing, yeah, whatever. But communion, like I look forward to that. Like that is something that we're only doing it once a month, so we're working on maybe improving that. But I just every now and then I'm like, wow, we should just like quit all this other stuff and like just have communion. Like it seems like that is where the actual feels like the souls meet. I don't know how to put it otherwise.
I agree. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's where the souls come together.
So I love that concept.
I think it was, I should have looked this up. I think it was the Moravians that actually shared the bread and cup every time they were together. Like every service, and they had a service every day. That's remarkable.
Well, it seems like that's what they did in Acts too. It says daily, so I'm assuming that meant every day. I'm probably not everybody every day, but
breaking bread from house to house. It almost looked like there was maybe the apostles or somebody visiting houses and breaking bread every day. That's exciting to think about.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept.
Yeah.
So it wasn't. You lived in the city, so it probably wasn't a huge deal for you to live in the city.
No, well, I can't say that because my wife and I met in Calgary, and we were married, and we had one child, and we moved to a town of Cochrane, which is about the city limits are on about 10 or 15 minutes apart, so it's not that far away. Cochrane was about 35,000 people, smaller town, but I saw it as a step out of urban living. My wife, third generation in Calgary, living outside the city seemed like a very foreign concept for her. And so we figured, well, if we go to a small town and then maybe a smaller town, and eventually I'm going to be on a piece of land and I'm going to teach my boys to do the chores, feed the chickens, milk the cows, ride the horses. I wanted to grow the garden, the whole bit.
So this is pre-conversion.
This is pre-conversion.
And you're working your way out of town.
That's right. And so we're converted, and that idea sort of just disappears, and we're just thinking about what we're doing, and we're brainstorming how we're going to reach our communities, and we end up making trips into Calgary, my wife and I, from Cochrane. Cochrane's a very religious town and hard to evangelize in. And so we would make trips into Calgary sometimes, and so that became more of our mindset and our focus. And I can't remember if it was before we left Cochrane, when the plans to move to Calgary, form a church there, and these things were starting to solidify, and it looked like this was actually going to happen. It was before we went to Boston. It hit me one day, and I was out driving somewhere by myself, and it hit me that, Sam, you are not going to buy that piece of land and have the animals. And I grieved for days, I would say weeks. It was a hard thing to let go of, because it was so much a part of my vision for my family, the dream that I had for my children. My identity was wrapped up in that. I was always a farm boy. I mean, I loved it. I mean, we calved cows. I worked in the garden since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Like, it was my life. It was in my DNA. And I, did my little stint through the city, but that's where I was headed. And that realization that, no, you're not getting it. Unless, my wife and I have talked about it and kind of joked about it, that if we ever called to some place where we ended up with a piece of land, maybe on the edge of town or something, we wouldn't complain.
Right.
But that's in the Lord's hands. And I can say that I've truly let go of that dream because the work is too great in the city. The need is too great. So I want to teach my children how to work. It's just not going to be doing chores. I want to teach my children how to grow their own food, but it's probably going to be a little plot in my backyard.
So how can you do that? Like the tendency of Mennonites that move to cities is that the children, like this is what I've seen, what I think I've seen. I could be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I've seen that the children, just like the parents, gravitate away from manual labor towards, playing the piano, computer work, doing things that are more mental. And that's not wrong, but it does really change how you live your life.
It's true.
So is there any benefit in say the country way of living versus the city way of living? Like how do you kind of tease out whether you're going to what are you going to teach your children to help them maintain an appreciation for manual labor? Or maybe that doesn't even matter. I don't know. I mean, you're a construction worker, right?
I am, yeah. We frame houses. And Darren works with me and his oldest son. So my 17-year-old nephew works with me as well. Yeah, I've done construction for most of my life, other than stepping away here and there. And that's how we tend to think, because of, being raised in the rural where you did hard work and it was a way to clear your head and put life into perspective. But the thing of it is, like, there's other ways to do that. And I know that something that I've done before is ran every day, get some exercise. One thing that we do occasionally in Calgary is we go out and climb mountains. And that's something that we'll get a group together, and it's me and, one of the other brothers and some of the teenagers and even some non-teenagers, 10, 11 years old. And we'll go climb a mountain, and that's 8 hours of, I mean, you're leaving it all out there. Sometimes it feels like you're not sure you can keep going. And it's a way, I see that as an opportunity. You have to be more purposeful about it. Mm-hmm. You set a time aside, you make some plans, you get everybody together, and you go do it. And it's an opportunity for people to see you in a different environment. You're working hard. You see the young people see the older people, sweating and really, really getting down to some hard work. And so I guess one thing with urban living that has been impressed on us is, in regards to all of these things, there's an intentionality that has to come into place. With a farm, you could just tell your children to go outside. Things were getting a little hairy in the house. We'll go on outside. Just go do something. I think my mom's favorite thing to do was just give me work. And maybe that's why now that works for me to clear my head. Mm-hmm. It seemed like, the moment I was getting a little rowdy or something, it's, Sam, clean the windows, hoe the garden, get out of the house, go do something, clean the chicken coop, do something. And I feel like, there's nothing wrong with that, but I feel like it was a tool used to, instead of dealing with something because it's right here, we can just go outside. And in the city, you can say go outside, but they're just going to go into the backyard, and it's a small space, and the tension might continue back there. But we've talked about this often, that we have to be more intentional. We actually have to face the things that we're dealing with head on, and we have to think of solutions for the situations we're facing with teenagers or with young people or with little children or even 5, 6, 7-year-olds. If there's a tension or there's an energy that's going on that we don't know how to handle, then we're going to have to think about something to handle it. And maybe it is a trip to the park. Maybe it is, hey, buy everybody a bike. Get on your bikes. We're going for a bike ride and ride around the city for a little bit. And like there's things like that you have to do. And it does involve physical exercise.
That's something funny that I never, like, I would never in all my former life have thought that I would do, but I recently went out and bought a chin-up bar.
I see. Yeah, there you go.
Because I've thought about that, like, I have teenage boys, you know, we should be doing at least a few things. I mean, they work hard every day, but come evenings and there's nothing to do. And there's definitely that element of you can't just kick them out and let them race go-karts and four-wheelers around the back 40 or ride horses or whatever. Like, that's not an option in town.
That's right. Exactly. What I found, though, too, is it also gets you out to do it with them, because in the city you're less likely to put them out on their own unless they get older. You know, some of the older boys, it's safer for them. We live really close to Nose Hill, which is a 4,500 acre plot right in Calgary.
Oh, wow.
That's just wildlands, and it has trails and everything, and they ride bikes in there and stuff. And it's not even a half a mile from our house. So the older boys, obviously, you trust them to go out and do that. But I'm not going to tell Elliot, you know, my 7-year-old, go to the park.
Right.
You know, I'm going to have to go with him.
So what happens when you said that you talk about going out on trips to the mountain? Or out in the mountains? Do you do any overnight stuff?
We haven't yet. I've done overnight stuff with my nephew. We go hunting, and the one place we hunt is a 2-hour drive away, and we've spent out numerous nights out there.
So,
and it's something that we've talked about as a brotherhood that we would like to plan every year. Get the boys together, plan a trip, and go out into the wilderness.
I think that's so looking at the opposite side of your you know, when you live in the country, it's kind of, people obviously still do that kind of stuff. But it does seem like in the city, you have to make more, like you said, intentional.
Right.
And too often our intentional things are too scheduled, because we have to be more scheduled. It's just like cities force us to be more scheduled because we're not on a natural rhythm, we're on an artificial rhythm, and it just forces that. But the overnight trip thing, I feel like is really neat, because it does give you some, like you said, you get to know people on a different level.
Yeah.
We've done men's campouts once a year, and it's just incredible to see how men are different when they're kind of away from their responsibilities and families and what's going on there. But and also children, like our young people, it's really fun to get to interact with other young people, other young men. But I feel like young men probably face the biggest temptations, the biggest adjustments in town.
Right.
Like for the girls, it's not as big a deal. They're normally not outside a huge amount anyway. I mean, some girls like to do their garden and stuff, but
right. What we're considering, obviously, we're a new church and we have rising children. You know, they're getting older. We don't have a ton in the teenage. There's only a handful of them that are actually teenagers now. One thing they do is Clifford and Becky live really close to a tennis court, so they'll go and play tennis, and it's a way to burn off some energy and get some exercise. But we do have to consider the fact that as they get older, they do need some things to do, and there's something that we have to think about, that to provide, not only just, like, you don't want to just provide them one thing and a one-off. Like, there needs to be a lifestyle that's going to encourage involvement and we see it's necessary or important to have intergenerational interaction. And that's one thing that city life forces you to do is you're not as quick to kick the children out, say the adults can have a conversation. So the children are going to be a little bit more part of your conversation. And as they get older, even more so, because they're going to sit in the living room with you and do that. So there's a lot of ripple effect to this idea of living in the city and trying to be intentional with your young people. And I think one way to do that is to have occupations where you can put the young men to work as well. Construction's a good one, landscaping. There's always that work in the city.
So do you have the legal restrictions in Canada that we do in the U.S. as far as age restrictions on young people in construction?
You can be on site if your father's there at a fairly young age, like 14, and maybe even younger, because I know Miles, my nephew, has come on site numerous times, and Darren and I have talked about it, and I think as long as he's within arm's reach of his dad, it's okay, and he's 11.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's very young.
I guess I didn't realize there's a possibility there's a clause like that in the U.S. too, but normally it's going to be 16 for construction.
And if you were doing renovations and stuff like that, and less like building a house, I mean, there's a lot of things.
Yeah.
Fall off the roof, fall down a hole. But if you're going into a house to redo their bathroom or something like that, bringing your teenager in with you to do the work and stuff is a lot more of an option, especially if you're mowing lawns and stuff. Some of those industries have specific differences because you can hire students and stuff to mow lawns or paint. Painting's another one. You see a lot of hiring students for painting.
So the way we've got around it in our family is like my 16, well, he's now 17, but he bought a lawnmower when he was young, I don't know, 13, 14. His lawnmower, his money, his job.
I see.
I had nothing to do with it.
Uh-huh.
So I said, hey, if they want to come after you, that's okay.
That's
they probably won't do much.
Yeah.
I'm not involved.
We want to foster that kind of stuff, so they probably won't shut him down. Yeah, that's really good. And that's something my nephew's doing as well. He's 17, and he bought a snowblower and like an actual snow blower and a leaf blower to blow off sidewalks and stuff. And he wants to start building his clientele in the area. And that's amazing because he's working within, a 5-minute walk of home.
Yeah. And that is something that I think it gets really overlooked. When I was young, I lived way out in the country, way out in the country. And you want some more coffee?
I would have more.
And I was always bummed because I had some friends that lived closer to town.
Thank you.
And they could get jobs, mowing jobs,
making cash.
Yeah, make cash. Yeah. Me, I was stuck. Like I was out there, middle of nowhere, and there was virtually no opportunities except for what my dad tried to provide stuff for me, but I couldn't do my own thing. Where they were picking up lawn jobs and driving their riding mower around town and mowing different lawns. And
there's good money in that. I mean, I see the young boys being able to buy some things for themselves. I'm like, wow, good for you. I mean, you're getting out there and doing an honest day's work and making some money at it.
You need a fresh can?
No, thanks. I think one's good. You're going for 2?
You might need it.
I have 2 more meetings today, or 1 more. So, might need it. But that's one aspect I like about living in the city, though, is it feels like you have your children with you. They're around you all the time. And I know that when you're first thinking from the country perspective, that can be annoying sometimes. But you realize that that's actually a real blessing because they're in your circle of influence all the time. I mean, there's obviously they go down in the basement and play and stuff like that, but and it's something that we want to foster so that there's an intergenerational relationships. And as a brother in the church, I see it as a responsibility to foster those relationships with all the young men in my church, not just my own son.
Yeah, I really feel that too, especially getting in my age. Like I see that, wow, like I have boys, I have a lot of boys, but I'm looking at all the other boys in church and I'm thinking, wow, there's so much discipling to do here that I don't know. I mean, I'm not talking about just sitting down having a Bible study.
Right.
I mean, just teaching them how to work on a car, or it was really fun here just last weekend. My oldest son and some other boys changed a head gasket on one of the brothers' vans, and
Oh, wow.
they'd never done it before,
Yeah.
but I'd done it before, so I just I told them when they actually get down there to the technical stuff that I'd come help them out. So
That's
we're
pretty neat.
we're over there 11 o'clock at night, and there's 4 boys under the hood of a
That's
car,
awesome.
and I was like, this is community that I can get behind.
That's amazing.
And it's something that you can do in the city. You could do it in the country too, and I have. But there's just some of those things you just have to be more. It's much harder.
Yeah.
It's not like everybody has a shed that you can use. We had to find a place to be able to do it.
Exactly.
And, it's much more difficult, but I think it's definitely, there are things that can be done.
It's just it's a wrong caricature of city living to think that you can't raise a family in the city for God and teach them what they need to live in a godly way. It's totally just thinking from one box and saying that if it's not this box, you can't do it.
So why? I think you're right on. But why? From my perspective, you can tell me if I'm wrong. But from my perspective, every time Mennonites have tried to start churches in the city, it's failed.
Right.
I mean, I shouldn't say it's failed. They were pretty successful early on. Like, they brought a lot of people in, but then they lost out themselves and lost their next generation. So you're saying that's a false caricature, but how do you, like, the evidence is on their side?
It's hard to speak to that. I have an opinion, but I don't know if it's grounded in. I guess time will see what it's grounded in. And I don't know how to talk about it other than to say that it seems like there was a lack of adaptability. Like, there was this a Mennonite way of thinking that went along with it, that hampered it. And I don't know how that all plays out, or the impact of all of that, but the ones who seem to have done a good job, one thing that I see different is that they don't have we talked about earlier that, we have something to give you instead of we're equal human beings. And I would say the ones that I think about that have raised their families in the city and have godly children, they don't have that mindset that somehow we're here because we have something to give you. We do have something to give you. Don't get me wrong. I mean, we do have the gospel to share, but there's a difference when, I don't want to call it superiority because that's a wrong caricature of them, like they're somehow superior and stuff. But there's this idea that, what we have is right, and we want to bring you into it, instead of walking alongside people and saying, what, I'm human too. And I want to share my life with you, and my life happens to include Jesus Christ. And that doesn't make me better than you. It doesn't mean that God chose me over you or anything like that. Like, to me, it almost boils down, it comes down to even how our perspective of how we share the gospel, how we live the gospel, and all of that kind of stuff. It's, I don't know, like life on life evangelism, where, and for the reason I say this is because I've had to come to some realizations in my own mind. I used to would have thought it's us versus the world. And I'm unique, and I need you to be like me, and that'll save you. And I now, I guess because of my journey in the world, would say, I'm the same as you. I have the same dreams and passions, and I live my life the same way, and I eat the same, and I live in the same community, and I go to work at the same job. I just have hope in my heart that helps me overcome the circumstances. It doesn't even mean my life's that much better sometimes. Like, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to get sick and
Right.
my wife's not going to die of cancer. And it doesn't mean any of the things. I'm not special. Only Christ is. And so when that shifted in my mind, that I could look at people, and one of the experiences that I went through that actually changed that, or just one thing that happened, I'm sitting at a stoplight one day and a homeless person walks by in front of the vehicle, and they were in rough shape. For some reason I thought about getting close to them or like giving them a hug or something. I recoiled. It's like, whoa, I couldn't think about it. It was appalling. And the Spirit of God smote my heart so hard in that moment and told me that I love that person exactly as much or more than I love you. And that was a leveling. Like, God, forgive me for my pride and self-righteousness. And I think that played a role in changing my perspective to somehow I'm an elite because I have Christ and I'm separate from the world and all this. Like, don't get me wrong, I believe in being separate from the world. But when we can shed that ego around who we are and walk with men and be in, I can think of Mennonite people that live that way. Mm-hmm. They don't have the airs. Like, I'm not saying this is, right off the Mennonites because of it, because I could name brothers that I know that live that way. Right. And I've always been amazed at the strong friendships they have with ungodly men. Mm-hmm. I was always, thought it would be wrong for me to have that strong of a friendship with ungodly men. And this speaks to my own ignorance more than it does, I would say, to maybe the setting I grew up in. So to have that leveled, because I was one of them, and now I'm just born again, I'm still one of you. And so I bring all that up. You say, what makes the difference between successful city churches and unsuccessful? Successful meaning, do they adhere to biblical, godly living? And I would say that when that illusion that somehow I'm here and I'm going to benefit you, we drop that. I think about it with even trying to help homeless people or feed them. I feel it all the time. The one day, my wife and I, feeling good about ourselves because we were doing the work of God, we drove into Calgary. And it was cold. It was about 40 below.
Wow.
It was really cold. And it had been for a couple of days. And we're sitting in our warm house in Cochrane going, there's about 2,000 people that live on the streets in Calgary. They're freezing.
At 40 below?
At 40 below. The shelters are packed. Okay. And I think they were actually opening up community centers and a lot of things like that. And so we went to the store, picked up a bunch of gloves, hats, I won't call them toques, and took them, and socks, and took them down there they had set up this whole tent village by the homeless shelters, and these people are living in these tents, like piling in, trying to conserve heat, and the one guy boils out of his tent and he's hollering, I ran out of propane, and he's getting cold. And so we get out, and I'm walking across the street to start handing out this stuff, and I'm thinking about the outfit I'm wearing. And I got pretty guilty because here I am. I mean, out of the goodness of my heart, I went to the store and spent a few dollars for some gloves and things like that to make an impact in these people's lives. And the motivation was pure. I was right. Like, I wanted to help these people. But it made me consider the life that I live. Am I so far removed from, I know homelessness isn't normal civilization or normal societal. Yeah. But have I removed myself so far from normal societal realms that how am I going to go tell this man Jesus loves him? Does it mean I get to wear a North Face jacket and Sorel boots? Because then, yes, I want to follow Jesus. These stories that I share with you are all part of that journey of like, get down, and walk among men as way Christ did. And Mennonite or otherwise, if that's the approach that we have going into cities to help people, then I think there's a good chance that we could make a difference.
So it was a trend back years ago for people to move into cities and do a children's ministry. And,
right.
some of that stuff. And one of my theories with that was that these people are probably the ones that are more evangelistic, which makes them slightly more evangelical, which makes my thing I'm trying to figure out here is did city missions fail because they were city missions, or did city missions fail because of the type of individuals that were drawn to city missions?
I don't know about the last part. I would say it hinges more on the first part.
Because they were cities.
Well, no, because they started a city mission.
Okay.
Do you talk about starting a country mission? No, do you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
It's that idea that somehow that's other.
It's a mission.
It's a mission. It's no different than, we're going to set these people aside and we're going to send them off to, Timbuktu. They're never going to be a part of the culture. They're never going to work. They're going to be supported.
Right.
And those people are only going to see us as the rich white people that don't lift a finger. But somehow we have the gospel and we're going to preach it to them. But they don't know how it lives out in their culture because the people that brought it to them aren't living it in their culture. They're living it outside their culture while they live there. So you have the exact same thing happening in the city. The people come in and they do their missions. I mean, I'm not criticizing the effort. I know that the hearts of these people are gold and they want to serve Jesus Christ in doing this. But sometimes we have to consider the methods we're doing it. When we go to people like they are other and treat them as a mission instead of immersing ourselves in their daily lives, like we are part of who you are. We're a part of the population that populates this world just as much as you are. We bleed, we cry, we do all these things. I feel like that plays a pretty big role in the success of our...
So you're saying that the failure of city mission was the whole, just the fact that it was not a city church, it was a city mission. And
Right.
people didn't live there as people that were just living there. There were people that were moving there, possibly. Some of them were supported. And there was, most of those missions had a lot of support from outside.
It's true.
For, if nothing else, at least for the church building, for the Sunday school, for the children's ministry or whatever, that there would have been a lot of outside support for that. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the value of, or the downside, I'm not sure which. It's not cheap to live in cities.
Right. Yeah.
So how can you afford to live in Calgary?
Well, I lived in Calgary before I was a believer, and I could afford it. So
Okay.
I can now still. Honestly, living in the city is expensive.
What's rent?
We pay $2,500 a month.
Canadian dollars?
Canadian dollars.
Wow.
Yeah. And Darren and Clifford, they probably pay upwards of $3,500 for their houses.
How big of a house?
A month. 5-6 bedroom.
Wow. So what's wages? Like, what do you?
Well, wages are generally higher there. Like minimum wage is $15 an hour. You can start no, you're not going to live in that house. That's right. There is an issue there. Like that is something that the government is talking about, and it's a serious problem. The price of living and the income that's made. So, I guess this comes under counting the cost of living in the city. But it's funny for my wife to hear people talk like this because she's lived in Calgary. She's the third generation. Like her mom's family came there from Belgium and moved to Calgary, and her dad's family, I think it was her grandmother that her grandmother on her dad's side that moved there from Italy. So when people ask questions like, how do you live in the city? She's like, what do you mean?
Like, how don't you, huh?
Yeah, like how do you live in the country? How do you survive? So just to give a little perspective there, that from the outside looking in, it's like, oh man, how does that even work? But I think this begs the question or the consideration, do the people of God worry about the resources to do God's work? That's what it kind of boils down to for me, is I'm raising a family in the city, and raising a family is not cheap. And Sometimes it's close to the wire financially. But I believe that we're where God called us to be. And I believe that there's a work that we won't get done in our lifetime in that city. And the Lord will provide. And I don't say that glibly. I say that knowing that there's times when it feels like it's a little bit closer than we'd want it to be. But we've never gone hungry, and we've never got kicked out of our house, and we've never had the heat shut off or the electric. And, we've never been able to, we've never been in a place where we couldn't cook a meal for somebody. It's real life, and it isn't pretty sometimes, but it doesn't mean that, well, this is too expensive, I'm going to pack my bags and go buy a $500,000 piece of land somewhere and farm so that it can be cheaper. To me, that looks a lot more expensive and involving than it does to just rent a house in Calgary and live.
Now, wait a minute. So if you go buy a piece of land and you farm, then and you're owning this land, and you're not just throwing that money away, like you're putting $2,500 a month just going nowhere, like just so you can be there and minister to these people. Like if you think about the collective, you're talking about, I think you said the other two are paying 35-ish. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about 7,000, 8,
probably
9.
Closer to 10 grand a month.
So you're talking about 10 grand a month for all of you together renting there. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of cash that could be put towards the Lord's work.
That's exactly where it's going. Oh, yeah. It is something we've talked about. Like, what does it look like to buy a house, and then we all pool our money and pay for it? Mm-hmm. And then you buy another one and you all pool your money and pay for it. Because technically you have about $10,000 a month that you could use as a tool to purchase houses. And we haven't started that process. We actually commissioned one of the brothers to crunch the numbers and see what that would look like, and set up a realistic time frame. And, it's something that we think about. Ideally, that would be an amazing thing that we could do, because it would lower our monthly expenses for everybody. And like you said, it would be more money to put toward the kingdom. So these are things that we're open to explore. The only problem is that, like you brought up, buying a piece of land and growing food and, all that kind of stuff. Unless you have $1 million, you're going to be a long ways from Calgary, which means the 1.5 million people that we're there to serve are going to get drive-by evangelism, basically.
Right.
They're not going to get that life-on-life exposure to the gospel, where there's people who are willing to walk with people, make mistakes with people, and show them the love of Christ at their table. You can still evangelize your neighbors, 2 hours from Calgary. I'm not saying that this is the only way to do it. Right. There's still people that are out there serving the Lord and blessing their neighbors and stuff like that. But we don't really think about the cost. It's there. It's a very real part of life, and it comes up from time to time, but it's never been in the light of like, is this sustainable? Are we going to be able to do it? Of course it's sustainable. Because it's just par for the course. It's just what you would expect to do if you're going to live in the city and do that. I guess money doesn't factor into our church's vision very much.
So what are the chances of you being able to build a church house in Calgary? Or a schoolhouse?
We have no intentions of either of those. We don't have any plans of building a church house or a schoolhouse. Now, if we wanted a space to use, there'd be lots of community halls and stuff like that you'd be able to use for cheap. Like if you wanted to have a meeting house, then we wouldn't build one. It would cost you millions of dollars probably to build one in the city. And if you need something, when there's a big gathering or something like that, we meet in our homes. We take turns meeting in each other's homes. Our goal is that, and obviously time will tell how this plays out, 4 or 5 families, we're getting too big. Now there's 3, A couple more move in. We're reaching about capacity. And one thing that we're talking about is, so if these two people come in and they're mature brothers and sisters in Christ that have good vision and understanding about the church and things like that, we would like them. So we live in Brentwood. And one thing that we're talking about is, what if we get them to settle in Varsity? It's 5 minutes away. And they are a part of our church and communion for a year or two. But they move into Calgary to do what we're doing, not to join us. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
And then every other family that moves to Calgary that comes from somewhere that has, they have an understanding of the kingdom. We're not creating a pile. We don't want a pile. We want a community. We want a church community in Varsity, in Dalhousie, in Trywood, in Charleswood, in I don't know. The names are escaping. There's so many communities in Calgary, and so we don't want a church house. But then if we all want to get together, then we'll probably rent a hall and we'll all meet in one place, and we'll have preaching and fellowship and food and all of that kind of stuff. So it kind of goes against our vision for the future to think about building a church house.
So why not build a church house? Like what, or even why not lease long-term meeting space? Like, well, why are you trying to, what's the goal with not doing that?
We'd like to keep it small for a number of reasons. One of them we touched on early on, close fellowship. We want to know these people inside and out. We want to share our lives together, be very close. And it also forces expansion. It forces pushing out. It forces discipling for the purpose that you're going to stand on your own feet, and you're going to be a brother in a congregation that the direction of that congregation is on you. So hopefully it removes the idea that I can come to a church and park and just kind of enjoy the benefits. We believe that disciples of Jesus Christ should be in the trenches. And one way of doing that is if we keep it small and we start new groups, and everyone, even the converts, bring a convert in. The goal of discipling a convert is that they would be followers of Christ, but that they also would be able to disciple someone else to be a follower of Christ. And if that's the case, then it doesn't matter if they're in our church or they're one in Varsity or Dalhousie or anywhere. It makes no difference which one of those churches they're in. And I realize that brings up questions about maturity and stuff like that. But I believe the Lord will give us wisdom as we go.
So your wife is a third generation city girl.
Yeah.
But most of the Mennonite women that are moving into town, I think the majority of them struggle with town living, city living. Just for some of the things that you say, like the children, you can't just kick them out in the backyard. You can't just let them out to hoe the garden.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been a struggle for any of your sisters, or is that just?
It hasn't. I'm amazed at the vision that the sisters in our congregation have for their community. One sister is meeting people on the street. She's homeschooling, finding things to do for her children. We do a homeschool thing every Thursday. They go to the park. They do things together. So they go sledding.
So you're saying that the sisters all homeschool also?
Yeah, they do.
Okay. Has that something they had a background in?
No, they started homeschooling before they came to Calgary, but it wasn't something that they would have had. Like the churches they would have gone to before would have had church schools.
Okay.
And so it's a fairly new, like within the last 5 years kind of thing.
Is there any, well, I didn't mean to cut you off. You were kind of in the middle of something there.
No, the sisters have embraced the vision, and one of them volunteers. Like one of them has 7 children and volunteers at a pregnancy care center once a week. Her husband stays home that day and looks after the household while she's away, and has made tremendous contacts there. Prays with needy mothers, people from so many different backgrounds, religions, and building good relationships with the people that she works with as well. And Another sister, like I said, I mean, she's ministering to people on the street. She's trying to help. There's a lot of homeless people that come through our area. There's a train station within a 5-minute walk of our house, and they kind of gravitate to the train stations and things like that. And I would say that the sisters there have embraced the work in Calgary wholeheartedly. And I can't say that I've ever heard any like complaint or even like, oh man, I wish I could just, send them outside. I don't know that I ever heard that. I mean, it's possible that they might have said it, but they are remarkable in that way. I mean, they all would have grown up in farms themselves, even raised their family on a farm for a while and then moved into Calgary. So they're feeling that stark contrast between rural and urban living.
So homeschooling can be very pretty intimidating for people that have raised their children. Normally you have a church school. So the sisters, have they pretty much been able to take that up, or how's that working?
They both taught school in the Mennonite schools.
Wow.
So it's a breeze. The one that is daunting is my wife. It's quite daunting for her. At this point, like we have a kindergarten in grade 2. So she does the bulk of the teaching and things like that. And she's doing an amazing job. And I've told her, like, as the children get older and they take on, more and more, I want to step in and help out with that and try to alleviate some of the homeschool burden for her. Because to her, it's a totally foreign concept. And she was quite resistant to it when we first started talking about it. But then it just takes considering the options to say, we don't have church schools. We're in Calgary. What's available? Well, nothing. So,
right.
It's the obvious choice.
You can't send them to public school.
No. And so I would say it's the most daunting for her, but she has a really good support system there at home.
Yeah, no, for my wife, it's definitely been the biggest thing too, is homeschooling. I shouldn't say the biggest thing, but one of the bigger things is homeschooling. She does a really good job. I feel like it's funny because she really feels like she doesn't, but it's just not true.
I know, they never feel like they do. Like, what are you talking about? Have you seen how he's improved in reading in the last 3 weeks? Like, this is amazing.
Yeah, I think it's, I wasn't really excited about adding that to her load, but hey, it works.
Yeah, it does.
And I feel like I'm not, none of our children are really excited about going to college, so we're not pushing them in that direction for sure. And I think they'll do quite well.
I think homeschooling provides a beautiful place for parents, especially mothers, because they usually carry the bulk of it, to interact with their children in a way that they wouldn't have if they sent them off to school.
Right.
And day in and day out. I think it's a beautiful relationship builder. Like, they go through some very hard things together relationally with their children, or they can. And I think it's very healthy. And I think fathers should be involved as much as they can. Obviously, we usually have to keep a job down and keep bringing in the bacon, but there's still time before work if you can, if you're not leaving too early, or in the evenings, or Saturdays. You don't want to be doing school on Saturday, but maybe that's when dad's home and when he can help out. Like, maybe there's some creativity that can go on there. One thing that I would like to do, as my children age, and I should have started this already because there are older children in the church that are homeschooling, is plan a class of some kind, like kind of a one-off, just for their enjoyment or whatever it could be. If it was about singing, or if it was about who knows what, whittling, pull them all together. I have a couple wood lathes, and bring them in and show them how to turn some wood. And it's something I've told the young men I was going to do, and I haven't followed through with that yet. So maybe this winter's the time to do it. But if the church has that mentality that we're in this together, so we homeschool, and that happens in each other's homes, but we're all doing the same thing. How can we bless one another in this? Instead of seeing it as you're at home homeschooling, we are too, we're all doing our own thing. We are a body of, we're the family of God. And there's got to be ways to pull things together and bless each other.
So one of the biggest things that I hear from Mennonites when we talk about homeschooling, that traditional Anabaptists, Mennonite, Amish have done church schooling,
Mm-hmm.
and the downside to homeschooling is that it promotes individualism.
Mm-hmm.
So are there ways to reduce that effect?
You mean individualism per family?
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm just thinking about it in the context of what we have there at home. It would be a little bit hard to be individualistic because, the brothers meet every Tuesday morning. The sisters meet every Friday morning. We're together every Wednesday. We're together for 8 hours on Sunday. And the homeschool moms and the children are together every Thursday afternoon. And they take turns planning events and stuff like that. And if the weather's bad, they're, doing something in their own home. So it's a little bit hard to give credence to that argument in light of our own experience.
But your children, that's different for adults than children. Like
Right.
your children, where are they learning to submit to other adults and
Probably in the church setting. So we get together at noon, and then, we have our lunch and communion, and then we're together all afternoon, and then we meet at 4 for our service, and then we have a supper together as well.
Oh, wow.
And then we clean up at 7:30 and we go home at 8. So we're together from noon till 8 o'clock every Sunday.
Wow.
And it's very much a part of raising children with that. That's something that me and my wife actively are teaching our children, that when, Darren says, stop running around, that's what that means. And, when, even if you're in the basement and Jack, my 17-year-old nephew says, hey, you're getting too loud, you got to respect that. So I find there's a lot of opportunity, and especially since we have church in each other's homes, that's pretty close quarters. And so there has to be some room for adults calling each other's children down a little bit sometimes.
Right. Well, hey, we're probably getting towards where you're going to have to go. You have a meeting at 4?
Yeah, I do. Wow, 2 hours.
Went by pretty
Not
fast.
bad. Did we cover anything?
Well, I don't know. That's my question. Is there anything else we should cover?
I don't know. I think we actually covered a lot. It's been fun, though.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been